Hello students, I welcome you all for this English class. So this is the first English class, fine. So in 11th standard you have got 6 units, totally you have got 6 units. In each unit will have a prose, a poem and a supplementary. Before getting into the topic, I want to ask a few questions. Are you ready? Fine. What kind of family do you have? A nuclear family or a joint family? I hope you know the meaning of nuclear family and a joint family. In nuclear family, you have your father, mother, maybe your siblings. But in joint family, you have your grandparents. The next question is, do you love your grandparents? In what ways your grandparents support you? In what ways they help you? You think about your grandparents for a few seconds, your grandparents for a few seconds, and then answer. In what ways your grandparents supports you, helps you? Fine. Most of us love our grandparents for so many reasons. They take care of us, they support us, they help us, they advise us, and the list goes on. In this story, the first lesson, the topic of the first lesson is the portrait of a lady. I repeat, the topic of the first lesson is the portrait of a lady. The portrait of a lady. So this lady refers to the grandmother, and this story was written by Pushpan Singh. This story was written by Pushpan Singh. About the author, page number 4, Kushwant Singh is an Indian novelist and a lawyer. He studied at St. Stephen's College, Delhi, and King's College, London. So, Kushwant Singh is an Indian novelist and also a lawyer. Firstly, he studied at St. Stephen's College, that's in Delhi. Later, he studied in London, King's College. He joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1947. As a writer, he is best known for his keen secularism, sarcasm, and love for poetry. He served as the editor of several literary and new magazines as well as 2 newspapers. Kushwant Singh was awarded with Padma Bhushan in 1974, Padma Vibhushan by the Government of India, and Sahitya Academy Fellowship by Sahitya Academy of India. The Mark of Vishnu, A History of Sikhs, The Train to Pakistan, Success Mantra, We Indians, and Death at My Doorstep are some of his brilliant works. One of the notable writers, Kushwant Singh, has written this story. The Portrait of a Lady by Kushwant Singh. Page number 1. Here is a story that brings out the bond between the author and his loving grandmother. First line. My grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. She had been old and wrinkled for the 20 years that I had known her. People said that she had once been young and pretty and had even had a husband, but that was hard to believe. Explanation: my grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. My grandmother here refers to the author's grandmother. Like everybody's grandmother was an old woman. So the grandmother was an old woman with a wrinkled face. What does mean by wrinkled? Wrinkled is having small lines because of old age. You might have seen a lot of old people's wrinkled faces. The author had always seen her like this for the past 20 years, which means the author is 20 years old. She appeared to be so old that he could not imagine her being young and pretty. My grandfather's portrait hung above the mantelpiece in the drawing room. He wore a big turban and loose fitting clothes. His long white beard covered the best part of his chest, and he looked at least 100 years old. He did not look the sort of a person who would have a wife or children. He looked as if he could only have lots and lots of grandchildren. As for my grandmother being young and pretty, the thought was almost revolting. She often told us of the games she used to play as a child. That seemed quite absurd and undignified on her part, and we treated it like the fables of the prophets she used to tell us. The author's grandfather's portrait hung above the mantelpiece. Mantelpiece is shelf in the drawing room. He wore a big turban. His clothes were loose. His long white beard covered the most part of his chest. He looked at least 100 years old. Looking at his portrait, one could not imagine him in his youth with his wife and children. The thought that the grandmother, being young and pretty, was almost revolting. Revolting means disgusting. The grandmother often told the children the game she used to play when she was a child, and those stories seemed quite absurd. Absurd means illogical and undignified on her part, and the children couldn't believe those stories. She had always been short and fat and slightly bent. Her face was crisscross of wrinkles running from everywhere to everywhere. No, we were certain she had always been as we had known her. Old, so terribly old that she could not have grown older and had stayed at the same age for 20 years. She could never have been pretty, but she was always beautiful. She hobbled about the house in spotless white, with one hand resting on her waist to balance her stoop, and the other telling the beads of her rosary. Her silver locks were scattered untidily over her pale, puckered face, and her lips constantly moved in inaudible prayer. Yes, she was beautiful. She was like the winter landscape in the mountains, an expanse of pure white serenity, breathing peace and contentment. So explanation page number 2. This is in page number 2. I'm explaining. Second paragraph to your left hand side. So the grandmother was short, fat, and slightly bent. So her face was crisscross of wrinkles running from everywhere to everywhere. So full of wrinkles. She was so old, terribly old, that she could not have grown older. But then she was always beautiful. She hobbled, Hobbled. Hobbled. Hobbled means walked unsteadily. You might have seen a lot of old people walked unsteadily. So she, here, the grandmother, walked unsteadily about the house in white dress, in spotless white, with one hand resting on her waist. So she is resting her one hand on her waist to balance her stoop. Stoop means bend, and the other telling the beads of her rosary. Beads means counting of the beads of her rosary. So she was doing some prayers. As you can see in the picture, in page number 2, under that paragraph, she's having something that is called the beads of her rosary. Silver locks were scattered. Silver locks here refers to her hair, the grandmother's hair. So the author compares the hair of the grandmother with silver locks, and it was scattered untidily over her pale, puckered means wrinkled face. The author kept on telling the face, describing the face of the grandmother, which means oh, she was so old and her lips constantly moved in inaudible prayer. So she was constantly, continuously doing some inaudible prayer. She was doing something, she was praying something inside her mouth. No one could hear what she was praying, it was unable to be heard. So she was doing that. Yes, she was beautiful. And on one side, the author kept on telling she was so old, her face was full of wrinkles, she was stooped, she bent, and she's counting her beads, and she was dressed in white, and her hats were silver. On the other side, the author kept on telling that the old grandmother was beautiful. He compares the grandmother's face, those calm face, with the winter landscape in the mountain. See, that's in page number, the last two lines, and expands. And expands means and widespread of pure white serenity. Serenity means calmness, breathing peace and contentment. Page number 2, to your left hand side, last paragraph. My grandmother and I were good friends. My parents left me with her when they went to live in the city, and we were constantly together. She used to wake me up in the morning and get me ready for school. She said her morning prayer in a monotonous sing song while she bathed and dressed me in the hope that I would listen and get to know it by heart. I listened because I loved her voice but never bothered to learn it. Then she would fetch my wooden slate, which she had already washed and plastered with yellow chalk, a tiny earthen ink pot, and a red pen, tie them all in a bundle, and hand it to me. After a breakfast of a thick, stale chapati with a little butter and sugar spread on it, we went to school. She carried several stale chapatis with her for the village dogs. The author and his grandmother were good friends. His parents left him to stay with her when they shifted to the city. In the village, his grandmother took care of all his needs. She was quite active and agile. She used to wake him in the morning and get him ready for school. She said her morning prayers in a sing-song manner while she bathed and dressed him in the hope that her grandson would learn them by heart. The author listened to the prayers because he loved her voice but never bothered to learn them. So, in this paragraph to your right hand side, page number 2, there is a word called monotonous. Monotonous means boring. Monotonous means boring. So, every morning she used to say some prayers in a monotonous sing song while she bathed and dressed the author in the hope that he would listen and get to know it by heart. But the author listened to the prayers because he loved her voice but never bothered to learn them. Then she would fetch his wooden slate, which she had already washed and plastered. Plastered means spread it with yellow chalk. She would take an earthen ink pot and a red pen and tie them in a bundle and hand it to the author. After having a thick stale chapati with a little butter and sugar spread on it for a breakfast, they used to leave for school. They here refers to the author and the grandmother used to leave for school. The author's grandmother always accompanied him to the school as it was attached to the temple. And the grandmother carried several stale chapatis with her for the village dogs. So I'm moving on to the next paragraph in page number 2 to your right hand side, second paragraph to your right. I'm reading first line. My grandmother always went to school with me because the school was attached to the temple. The priest taught us the alphabet and the morning prayer, while the children sat in rows on either side of the veranda, singing the alphabet or the prayer in a chorus. My grandmother sat inside reading the scriptures. When we had both finished, we would walk back together. This time, the village dogs would meet us at the temple door. They followed us to our home, growling and fighting with each other for the chapati we threw to them. So, explanation of this paragraph. The priest taught the children the alphabet and the morning prayer. The children sat in two rows in the veranda. You know veranda, right? So they would sing the alphabet or the prayer in a chorus. While the author learnt his lessons at school, we've already seen temple is attached to the school. So the grandmother would read scriptures, the holy scriptures in the adjoining temple. On their way back, they would feed stale chapatis to the dogs, and the dogs followed them to their home, growling and fighting with each other for the chapati they threw to them. Next paragraph, page number 2 to your right hand side. When my parents were comfortably settled in the city, they sent for us. That was a turning point in our friendship. Although we shared the same room, my grandmother no longer came to school with me. I used to go to an English school in a motor bus. There were no dogs in the streets, and she took to feeding sparrows in the courtyard of our city house. So here comes the turning point in the relationships of grandmother and the author. The turning point came in their relationship when they moved to the city to stay with the Kushwant Singh's parents, which means the author's parents. In the city, the author went to an English school in a motor bus, which means bus. The grandmother could not accompany him to school because there was no temple attached to those schools. As there were no dogs in the streets, the grandmother took to feeding the sparrows. I stop. Let's see the summary of today's class. In The Portrait of a Lady, Kushwant Singh has given an account of his grandmother. He draws a lifelike portrait. She was very old. Her face was wrinkled. Her hair was white. It was hard to believe that once she had been young and pretty. His grandfather's picture hung above the mantelpiece in the drawing room. He wore a big turban. His clothes were loose. He looked at least 100 years old. It was hard to believe that he had once a wife or children. Kushwant Singh's grandmother was a short lady. She was fat and slightly bent. She couldn't walk straight. She hobbled about the house. She had to keep one hand on her waist. It was to balance her stoop. In the other, she held a rosary. She was always telling the beads. Her lips constantly moved in prayer. She put on white clothes. Her silver locks scattered over her pale face. She looked like snowy mountains in winter. She was a picture of peace and contentment. She was very old. Perhaps she could not have looked older. She looked the same for the last 20 years. Kushwant Singh's and his grandmother were good friends. His parents went to city. They left him with her in the village. She took good care of him. She used to wake him up in the morning. She got him ready for the school. She said her morning prayer in a sing-song manner. She hoped that she would learn it by heart. He liked her voice but never bothered to learn it. Then she would fetch his wooden slate. She had already washed it with plastered it with yellow chalk. She would take an earthen inkpot and a red pen. She would tie them in a bundle and hand it to him. She would give him a thick stale chapati with a little butter and sugar spread on it. It was his breakfast. She carried several stale chapatis with her for the village dogs. His grandmother always went to school with him. The school was attached to the temple. The priest taught the children the alphabet and the morning prayer. The children sat in two rows in the veranda. They would sing the alphabet or the prayer in chorus. The grandmother sat inside the temple. She would read holy books. Then they would walk home together. The village dogs would gather at the temple door. They threw chapatis to them. The dogs would growl and fight with each other. The narrator parents sent for them in the city. It was a turning point in their friendship. With this, I stop today's class. We'll continue in the afternoon session. Thank you.